the diversity. Okay, we got it. The recording is in process. Okay. I'm chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the Temple, and welcome to the third session of our anti-racism series. Today, we are happy to have Dr. Karen Gaffney presenting on unlearning racial myths. Dr. Gaffney is professor of English at Raritan Valley Community College in New Jersey. Her book, Dismantling the Racism Machine, a Manual and Toolbox, published by Routledge, is an accessible introduction to race and racism with tools for action. She presents at national conferences, serves on the steering committee of the Hunterdon County Anti-Racism Coalition in New Jersey, co-facilitates the community course on racism. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, my Zoom sometimes does a crazy thing and it disconnects me. Dr. Gaffney presents at national conferences, serves on the steering committee of the Hunterdon County Anti-Racism Coalition in New Jersey, co-facilitates the community course on racism based in Somerville, New Jersey, and manages the anti-racism website Divided No Longer, available at www.dividednolonger.com. Follow her on Twitter, also at Divided No Longer. We also, as I mentioned, have our high school students with us today, along with their teachers. I believe our Rabbi Aaron Glazer is here, and Director of Youth Engagement, Kelly Whitehead. I always say that, Kelly. Welcome all. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few thank yous. One to Audrey Napshin, our Executive Director, and Michal Levine, our Temple Administrator. Without their assistance, this series and many other things would never happen. Special thanks to Michal today, who is our Zoom master, and she knows how much her being here means to me. And a thank you to Elsa Weinstein, Chair of the Library Committee, whose support also helped to bring this program to Temple today. I'm sorry, it happened again.
Hello, sorry if it was my turn. I was talking to the high schoolers. Can I?
No, my Zoom is doing very funny things, and sometimes it bugs me off, and then I just have to get back on. So
we can hear you, Lenore. We can hear you and see you. So whatever your computer's doing, it's okay.
Yeah, okay, because I lose you. So okay. So I thanked Elsa Weinstein and the library committee, and we will have time for discussion after the presentation. So please put your questions in the chat or use the reactions button and click that and raise your hand. There's a function there. Does everybody know that? Just hit that button and there'll be a raised hand, and Dr. Gaffney will be able to keep track of all of that. Now, Kelly would like to say a few words before Dr. Gaffney begins. So Kelly,
I'm here. Good morning.
Here you are. Okay, you're on.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Gaffney, for being here. I'm also joined today by some of our high school students who are off screen because the camera's facing this way. But I hoped, as someone who also provides diversity, equity, inclusion training through a Jewish lens, could kind of set the scene for you today through some Jewish framing. So today we're going to learn more about how to dismantle the systematic racism that affects our daily life. So as Reformed Jews, this work is important because of our deep value of B'Tselem Elohim, this idea that we are created in God's image, that we are all holy beings. I'm trying to talk to the high school students as well as the screen. So this foundational belief in the equality of all humans was established in the opening chapters of the Torah. It's one of our first teachings. So regardless of whether we believe the creation story actually happened, its position as one of the first lessons in the Torah gives it a place of high priority. All human beings are created equal. This belief in equality compels action in response to discrimination, racism, and racial injustice. So if all of humanity is made in God's image, then clearly any kind of prejudice or racism is forbidden. As Dr. Gaffney will explain, this equality does not always translate because of systems and biases in our inequitable world. Within the reform movement, the work of racial justice reaches back from beyond the civil rights movement. We have an obligation to learn about racial diversity, confront our implicit biases, challenge the deep, systematic and cultural sources of those biases, and address the racial disparities that are found in our society. In order to create racial justice in America as Jews, we must look deeply into and change our own beliefs about our neighbors, for we are taught to love our neighbor as ourselves. And we must change the systems and structures that perpetuate these racial injustices. This is not easy work to do, but it is our sacred obligation. The Talmud, our foundational text, makes clear that every human, as an image of God, is endowed with three distinct intrinsic dignities: infinite value, equality, and uniqueness. So let us work to ensure the value of all people, and of course, give a warm welcome to Dr. Gaffney.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to begin by, again, thanking Temple Sinai of Summit for inviting me. And I also want to acknowledge that you've been co-sponsoring a variety of other events, and I really appreciated being invited to two of them. I attended, several weeks ago, I attended the panel discussion of the documentary film Ferguson Rises that featured the father of Michael Brown. And that was an extremely powerful film and discussion. So I hope you were able to attend that. And then I also really appreciated the presentation recently by Rabbi Gershon about the parallels between Jim Crow segregation in the US and Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And the influence, he talked a lot about the influence that American eugenicists had on Nazi policy. And so I thought that was also really powerful. I hope you had a chance to attend that as well. So I will try to kind of make a couple of connections back to both of those events in my presentation. But also I invite you, if you attended one or both of those, I encourage you to think about the connections as well. And after I'm done and we're having some discussion and Q&A, I encourage you to think about sharing some of the connections that you're noticing. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I will share some slides. I'll talk through them in order to explain some basic concepts that I'd like to address. And then I will open it up for a good amount of discussion and Q&A. And so I'm going to ask you to hold off on asking your questions until I'm done sharing my slides and really have a chance to open it up for discussion. And at that time, I'll encourage you to put questions and comments either in the chat, or if you would like to actually speak up, then I encourage you at that time to click on the reaction button and to click on the raise hand button, and then I can call on you to speak up. So I just wanted to put into the chat before we get started my website, just so you have easy access to many resources that will help support the ideas that I'll be sharing today. So if you have the chat open, you can click on the link I just put there, and that is a page on my website that focuses on resources, general resources about race and racism. And so the concepts I'll be sharing with you today, obviously, this is just, a relatively short amount of time. And so I'll just be touching upon these ideas briefly. And so if you want more in-depth analysis, you want videos, you want articles, or you want links to books, then please, I urge you to take a look at my website. And so again, that's in the chat if you are interested. All right, so I'm going to get started, and let me just get organized here. So I'm going to share my screen. And so today's presentation, as you may know, is called Dismantling the Racism Machine, Unlearning False Racial Myths. And this work is based on my book, Dismantling the Racism Machine, a Manual and Toolbox, that came out a couple of years ago. At the end of the presentation, I can, if you're interested, give you a link to purchase it from Routledge, and I can give you a coupon code for 30% off if that is something that interests you. Or you can certainly ask your local library to get it if they don't have it already. All right, so what I would like to focus on here is to just start by explaining my general approach. And that is focusing on first, what I call developing an anti-racist mindset. And that really is about one's interior work, especially for white people. And I focus on unlearning false racial myths that we were often taught. And when I say taught, I don't necessarily mean consciously taught, although that's part of it. It's also unconsciously taught, how we have absorbed messages from the media, from our family, from our educational settings, and so much more. The false racial myths that I'll be talking about are essentially everywhere throughout the United States and beyond, but today I am focusing just on the US. And so if we are born in the US, we breathe in those false racial myths since birth. And so if we're passive, or if we say we're not racist, but we're not actively doing anything, then we're not really questioning those myths. And so one challenge that we face is that there is really what I consider to be a massive gap between what scholars who study race and racism take for granted and what the public, especially what the white public, knows. And so in directly naming these myths and debunking them, that is part of this, again, what I call developing this anti-racist mindset. But if we, think about becoming aware of them and recognizing their damage, then we can work on unlearning those myths. We can work on becoming unindoctrinated. You might recall that Rabbi Gershon spoke a lot about the ideology of racism, both in the US and in Germany, as an indoctrination. And so I invite us to become unindoctrinated and to have an anti-racist perspective that is active and not passive. And also, I just want to emphasize that unlearning these myths is a lifelong journey. It is never ending. I've actively been working on this for more than 20 years, and I will be actively doing this for the rest of my life. And so this is something that I think we need to be able to get into the constant habit of. It's not just a one-time only event or reading one book or watching one film. So then we need to also think about, well, what do we do with this, this shifting mindset? We can't just do the work in our heads. We need to actually apply an anti-racist mindset and take action, working towards racial justice, really thinking about how we can resist these myths on a daily basis. And so these are what I'd like for you to think about as we have our conversation today: developing an anti-racist mindset and then applying that anti-racist mindset. So let's get started. So what is the first myth that I would like to talk about? That is what I consider to be really this foundational myth, and that is the myth that human races are biologically different. And so we are often taught to think that two random white people are closer biologically to each other than a random white person and Black person. But that is just simply not true. Again, we're taught to think, if we look at the pictures here, that there is something biological, something inherent, something natural that connects the two people on the left-hand side and the middle of the screen, that is something the person on the right-hand side of the screen does not share. And again, this is just simply not true. There are so many scholars, and this is where my website comes in, so many scholars who for years have talked about the reality that there are no inherent or genetic differences or scientific differences or biological differences between groups that we call races, because race is a human invention. It is a social construct. It is constructed and built, created by society. I'll point to one scholar, one of my favorites, Dorothy Roberts. She wrote a book called Fatal Invention. And I just love the language of that title, Fatal Invention. And her subtitle, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. So a couple of points to keep in mind. Again, I'm just going to mention a few things here. And if you want to learn more, I encourage you to go to my website. So no matter where we look across the entire planet, human DNA is about 99.9% identical. There is no scientific way to separate human beings into, quote, races. Human beings are actually one of the most genetically similar of all species. So of course, people say, well, what about skin color? So of course, yes, human beings have skin color and our skin color does vary. And there are genes that influence skin color. But these genes do not correlate with the majority of our other traits. And skin color varies along a spectrum. Where would you draw the line between quote unquote races? And also we might want to acknowledge that skin color variation is a relatively recent trait that reflects where one's ancestors settled in relation to the equator. So we've been taught to think that skin color is a sign that humans are biologically distinct from each other. But again, that is a myth. And I want to emphasize this because this is a myth that some people say is diminishing in its popularity, but unfortunately, recent evidence shows more people believe this myth in the past 10 years than they had. So just a couple of touchstones. You might recall back in the year 2000, when Bill Clinton was president, he had this big announcement at the White House of the Human Genome Project, and they really focused on race not being biological. They were very, very explicit about that. Dr. Craig Ventnor said in this ceremony, the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. And so many people thought 20 plus years ago, okay, finally, now we can move on and really focus on race being a social construct. But unfortunately, over the past decade, the belief that race is biological has actually grown in popularity in the United States. Various scholars have talked about this and acknowledged this. I will point specifically to the 2019 book called Superior: The Return of Race Science by Angela Saini, a really excellent book that explains this. And she says, scientific racism has come out of the shadows, at least partly because wider society has made room for it. So again, this belief is rising rather than diminishing. And not only is it rising, but the myth that race is biological is incredibly dangerous. It serves and has served as a rationale for white supremacy for centuries. It serves as a rationale for anti-Blackness, imperialism, genocide, colonialism, land theft, slavery, segregation, immigration restrictions, the eugenics movement. And again, Rabbi Gershon focused on that just a couple of weeks ago. This myth determines who is considered, quote, civilized and who is considered fully human. And so what I would like to do is to look at two contemporary examples of the damage that this myth can do. One is related to the criminal justice system, and one is related to healthcare. If you attended the film screening Ferguson Rises and the event with the discussion that included the filmmaker and Michael Brown's father, then this quote might be familiar to you. So in 2014, a white officer, Darren Wilson, shot and killed unarmed Black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And this is a statement that he gave during his grand jury testimony. He was not indicted. And so I'm going to take a moment and ask for a volunteer to unmute themselves and to read this statement that Darren Wilson gave during that grand jury testimony. Would somebody be willing to read what's in quotation marks in the middle of the screen?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you, Michael. Go ahead.
You're welcome. And when I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. Michael Brown had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. That's how angry he looked.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for reading that.
You're welcome.
And so again, I want us to think about the language here, this especially the word demon, which is a reference to something that is not a human being. And so this belief that Darren Wilson had of Michael Brown Jr., that he was not fully human, is at the heart of the myth that race is biological. And so again, I think it's extremely important for us to understand the incredible danger that this myth can have. And I'm just giving you one example here that relates to the criminal justice system, but unfortunately, there are so many other examples that we could point to. I would also like to bring in an example from the healthcare system. And this is a quote, and in a moment I'll ask for another volunteer to read this for us. This is a quote from a 2016 Washington Post article. And if you want to see the full article, again, that is on the website address that I gave you. And as you listen to this language, I want you to think about the harm being caused of the perpetuation of the myth that race is biological. So I would love to ask somebody else to unmute themselves and to read this quote from the Washington Post for us. And again, this was just in 2016.
I'll read it.
That? Thank you, Bev. Go ahead.
Researchers at the University of Virginia quizzed white medical students and residents to see how many believed, inaccurate at times, fantastical differences between the two races. For example, that Blacks have less sensitive nerve endings than whites, or that Black people's blood coagulates more quickly. They found that fully half thought at least one of these false statements presented was possibly, probably, or definitely true. Moreover, those who held false beliefs often rated Black patients' pain as lower than that of white patients, and made less appropriate recommendations about how they should be treated.
Thank you, Bev, for reading that.
Horrible.
And so absolutely very horrible. And this is not just an isolated case at this one medical school. Unfortunately, there is a pattern, not just by our future doctors, but also by our current doctors, of Black patients' pain not being taken as seriously as white patients' pain. And this is yet another legacy of slavery. So if we go back in time and we think about what happened during slavery, one of the rationales that was used, again, connected to the belief that race was biological, was that Black people felt less pain than white people and were therefore more conducive to slavery as a condition. And so that was a rationale that was very much used by scientists during that time, by politicians. It was a mainstream approach. And still today, throughout the United States, We have the legacy of that myth alive and well. You might recall that the famous tennis player, Serena Williams, when she gave birth to her child not too long ago, she had a horrible experience right after that, where she knew that she had a medical problem, and the nurses and doctors would not listen to her, and she almost died. And eventually she was listened to, and things turned out okay. But if we imagine that somebody of her wealth and celebrity status have trouble convincing a doctor about their own body, then just imagine what the situation is for other Black women, which explains, unfortunately, how the US has a disproportionately high Black maternal mortality rate. So again, I'm really trying to emphasize the incredible harm and danger that the myth that race is biological continues to have today. And we can absolutely go back in time and trace the origins of this myth into the creation of a racial hierarchy in the US. And there's so many other examples that we can look at in other systems as well. But I'm going to move on here to the next myth that I would like to consider. And that is that if we think about chipping away at this particular myth, that race is biological, and we recognize that race is actually a human invention, then we're able to see what I call the racism machine. It becomes more visible. And that leads us to our second myth, the myth that race has always existed, the myth that whiteness has always existed. And so we've been taught to think, I certainly grew up thinking, that people have always thought of each other in terms of race, that people have always assigned value to skin color. But this is simply not true. It is yet another false racial myth. And so the reality is that race is actually a relatively recent human invention. People did not always associate value with skin color. This belief is relatively recent. One location that we can look to and that I focus on is colonial Virginia in the 1600s. In the early years of that colony, the line between servant and enslaved person was ambiguous. The main dividing line was not skin color. It was actually whether you were in the small number of elite wealthy landowners versus the labor, the people who worked that land. And people wouldn't necessarily identify as Black or white in those earliest years. They focused more on nationality and religion and language. And then we had an uprising, many of them, but one that's famous is called Bacon's Rebellion. That was 1676. And that rebellion was made up of people we would call white, people we would call Black. Again, they didn't necessarily see those categories yet. They would soon, but not yet. And so they formed solidarity and alliances together to rise up against the small number of elite wealthy landowners. And it probably wouldn't surprise you to hear that those wealthy elite landowners felt very threatened by this large uprising. And so what ultimately happened was the invention of racial categories and the invention of a racial hierarchy. And there are many different ways that we can look at this. I'm just going to show you one right here, which is the legal slave codes passed by colonial Virginia in 1705. Okay, and so one of the things that these slave codes did was that they took away various rights from people who were Black. So the right to vote, serve on a jury, hold office, Black people with property had those rights. They were taken away. And now they were considered, quote, persons incapable in law. In addition, enslaved Black and Native American people are considered, quote, real estate. And just think about that language. That is the language in this law, real estate. So when we think about real estate, we think about property, we think about objects, we do not think about human beings. But this is the creation of a system of chattel slavery where slavery becomes a permanent condition. And so enslaved Black people and some Native American people can now be written into wills as an inheritance. Again, an object, just like land or furniture. At the same time as the status of Black people was being lowered, the status of a new group of people, now called white, was being raised. And so this is a perfect example of divide and conquer. You take one very large group of people, now you impose racial categories to divide, and then you position those categories on a racial hierarchy in order to conquer. And so even though we take this word white for granted, this was a new word being used to describe a human being. The first time Virginia uses the word white is not until 1691, and they had been a colony since 1607. Decades went by, and there was no reference to any human being called white. But now you start to see it everywhere. And so this new group of people called white, who had to be taught they were white, are in this condition of servitude that is temporary. Indentured servitude is a temporary condition, and this law reinforces that. This law also reinforces at the end of their servitude, they are entitled to food and money and a weapon, and those are itemized in this law. And if they don't get what they're entitled to, they're allowed to go to the court to demand their rights. Okay, so again, in this comparison, Black people, Native American people have lost their rights. They no longer have any rights. And white servants are gaining rights. Okay. I want to just point to another of my favorite scholars. Her name is Michelle Alexander. You might be familiar with her book, The New Jim Crow. She calls whiteness, the creation of whiteness, she calls this a, quote, racial bribe. And she says that European laborers were bribed with this new idea of whiteness in order to turn against enslaved Black people. And I just think that language of whiteness as a racial bribe is really powerful. And it enforces this notion of divide and conquer. It also, the financial component to this also reinforces how this whole system is very much connected to the rising system of capitalism. Okay, we are going to jump ahead many, many decades. And what I would like for you to think about is how the myths that I've talked about already were built into the founding of the United States and fully established by the 1800s. And so now we're jumping ahead to the mid to late 1800s and this ideology of manifest destiny that's represented in this painting. So think about what you see here. All right, take a look at the right side of this painting. You might think about the right side of this painting as the Eastern United States and the left side as the Western United States. Do you see the bright sunny light on the right side? The side already supposedly benefiting from colonization and then the formation of the United States as a nation. The white woman is moving westward, bringing light into land that looks darker and foreboding because of the presence of indigenous people. Manifest destiny was the ideology of white supremacy that focused on white settlers deserving to live on the land that became the United States more than the land's original inhabitants. The myth was that white people deserve this land because they are inherently, biologically, the most civilized, the most human, the most deserving. Think about how that centuries-old ideology is alive and well today. This map of native land is not the map that we usually see when we see representations of what is now the United States. American history often makes this map invisible. I certainly did not see this map when I was growing up. Instead, this is the map that I saw. This was ever present in my classrooms from kindergarten to high school. Yet this land was never called stolen. Instead, I took this map and these 50 states for granted as normal, as the way it's supposed to be. So to connect these ideas together, if we don't recognize that race is constructed, then we normalize or take for granted whiteness as the default and the ideology that white people are superior. We take for granted a racial hierarchy based on anti-Blackness. And if we don't recognize that race is constructed, we think race and whiteness have always existed, and we see race as natural and biological. And the past and present systemic racism are invisible. So that brings me to the third and last myth that I want to talk about. This is the myth that the civil rights movement ended racism. So as we jump to the present, we might hear things that, we might hear that systemic racism is no longer a problem, or that slavery is over, or that, well, we had a Black president, so how can there be racism anymore? The reality, of course, is that systemic racism is a serious problem in the US today, and it manifests itself in every single system that we have. These are just a couple of examples. The persistence of housing segregation and school segregation, which relate to unequal access to resources, high Black maternal and infant mortality rates, the lack of diverse representation in media and popular culture, and racially disproportionate surveillance, arrest, and incarceration rates. One way to think about the persistence of systemic racism is to ask, well, who has the power? And one way of thinking about power is to look at our US Senate and US House of Representatives. And this is just, again, an image from our current 117th Congress. And so you'll see that the percentage of Black people of, in the language here is Hispanic, of Asian, of Indigenous, is not reflecting the actual population in the United States. Another way we might think about power is the racial wealth gap. And we need to think about New Jersey. The New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and if you're not familiar with their work, that is an amazing organization, so please check it out. They do really brilliant research about how New Jersey has one of the worst racial wealth gaps in the entire country. As they say, the US has a racial wealth gap problem and New Jersey has a disaster. It relates directly to who can live in which neighborhood, which connects to redlining and its legacy, as well as who has the financial resources for which neighborhood, and which neighborhoods have had resources and infrastructure added, and which neighborhoods have had them stripped away. This relates again to intergenerational wealth. whose grandparents, for example, had access to government subsidized opportunities like post-World War II low interest loans and a college education. It also relates to the legacy of slavery. Growing up in New Jersey, in the rare times that slavery was discussed in my school, it was something that happened someplace else, definitely not here, someplace far away in the South. We were the good guys in the North. I didn't learn until college that slavery had even occurred in New Jersey. And not only that, but that New Jersey was the last state in the North to have slavery. Most of my current college students who've graduated from high school recently in New Jersey haven't been exposed to this history either. So in New Jersey, if white people in particular think of racism as something that happens someplace else, then racism is never going to end. I believe here in New Jersey, white people in particular need to recognize how we've been indoctrinated into false racial myths and to work on unindoctrinating ourselves in order to develop an anti-racist mindset. And then we need to think about how can we apply this anti-racist mindset and create change. And that's what I want to end with here. And so when we think about taking the myths that we've just been talking about, debunking them, really trying to recognize the harm that they cause, then we need to start to ask ourselves, how do we see these myths being upheld in the world around us? Maybe it's at our job, maybe it's in our town, in some other capacity. And we need to start to think about, well, how can we debunk them and end their influence? And it's very hard to take action by yourself. And it's not something that is usually very effective. And so with that in mind, what group do you want to work with to take action? A group of your coworkers, people in town, a volunteer organization, your neighborhood, your temple, whatever group it might be, how can your group be structured so that racial justice is a priority in every project, not just, certain times of the year that we're in right now? How can your group be structured so that communities of color most directly impacted are leading the decision-making process? How can your group be structured so that racial justice is not an afterthought? And how can your group focus on the impact of decisions and policies rather than the intention behind them? In other words, the intention might be for racial justice, but if the impact actually harms people of color, then that's obviously a problem. And so I really want to emphasize the importance of continuing to work on developing an anti-racist mindset. Again, that is a never-ending journey, but then also starting to apply that anti-racist mindset with whatever group you're most connected to, or consider joining an already existing racial justice organization with a project that you can support. So I am going to end here with one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing here. And we are going to open it up for some discussion. So let me just take care of a few things right here. So there's a question in the chat. You have used the terms white and black. How can we use other terms that are not binary and continue the myth of race? So I think that's a great question. So one of the things that I think is important to think about is we've often been taught, at least I was taught growing up, to be colorblind, right? That's often the language that we might have heard. But as it turns out, that sort of idea is actually really harmful because it is not recognizing the experiences of Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, Asian Americans. And so we cannot, in my opinion, get to the point of not needing to use these terms until we directly confront these issues. So someday we might not need to use words like white or black, but until we're able to directly confront a racial hierarchy, confront white supremacy, then I think these are the kinds of terms we have to use. But also I want to emphasize that people need to, we need to make sure that when it comes to individuals, we are using terms that, that they want to be self-identified as. So that's the most important thing. If we're talking about a specific person, how does that person self-identify, and respecting that? I think that's especially important. But I use the term Black because that is a term that many of the writers and scholars and activists that I hear from and work with focus on. To them, it is more inclusive than African American because it can also include immigrants from Africa who might not identify as American, immigrants from Europe or the Caribbean or Asia, who again might identify as Black, but not necessarily as American. So I hope that helps. It looks like Andy has your hand up. So why don't you go ahead with your comment? Yes, please go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead, Andy.
My question is, one of my pet peeves, what's your position on a lot of the forms that we fill out, even generic forms for a doctor or whatever, always ask the question of what's your race, white, Caucasian, Black, Hispanic. And that always bothers me, since these are not real racial, they're not real races, they're social constructs. And we're almost perpetuating the myth that there are races. I don't like the fact, I guess it's optional, you don't have to answer those questions, but the fact that they put those on the form almost reinforces people's feeling that they are races, and they're not. And that bothers me a lot.
So thank you for that, Andy. I agree with you. So I absolutely hear so many times from my students say something like, how can race not be biological? We're always asked about it, and it's always on these forms. And so I'm just going to quickly use the census as an example. The census started being conducted right after the United States was created as a country. So the first census was 1790. It has been conducted every 10 years up until just 2 years ago. Every time we've had a US census, there has been a question about race. Almost all the other questions have changed. There's been a lot of variety, but that is the constant. But what's really interesting is every 10 years, the language used to ask the question about race and your options for answering has changed. And so to me, the census is a perfect example of race being a social construct, because it literally is reconstructed every 10 years. But what I think is so challenging with the census is that for most of the history of the census, a census worker would fill out the form. You as an individual were not allowed to fill it out. A worker would come to your door, and up until 1960, they would decide your race. They would fill out the form. And so what happened, especially at the height of the eugenics movement at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, the directions for the census workers explicitly stated that race was scientific and they better do a good job of identifying people in the correct racial category, because this was imperative for the future of the country. And that was, again, under the umbrella of the eugenics movement. And so now today, if you look at the website, and I study this for the census, and they talk about race, it explicitly says race is a social construct. Now, they don't acknowledge there that they didn't used to think that, and their past language was extraordinarily harmful. But we might read between the lines and sort of see this shift to focusing on race as a social construct, which goes back decades. This is not new. But what's interesting is the census website also says now they are asking people to to fill out the racial categories so that they can enforce civil rights. And if they don't collect information about people's races, then they won't be able to make sure that resources are spread equitably. And there are many nonprofit organizations whose livelihood depends on those kinds of results. And so this is essentially an absolutely impossible situation. So we get census results, and some might say a positive about that is that nonprofit organizations working to help address racism are able to use that to get funding to do things that we would think are good. Okay. On the other hand, as soon as the most recent census numbers were announced, the focus was on the number of people identifying as white is shrinking. And this is one of the fundamental fears of within white supremacist organizations in the United States. And so the idea that white people will someday, not too long from now, be considered a statistical minority, not minority in power, but a statistical minority, is perceived as a huge threat, an existential threat. And so my concern is that the census questions and the announcement of the census results fuels that fear. And that has caused, so, I mean, honestly, I mean, we could go in so many directions here, but it has caused lots and lots of harm. And so we are in an essentially sort of impossible situation. I would love to see some radical changes made to the census, but it is also reflecting, the atmosphere as well. So thank you for that. That's a really important question. And I want to go back to, there's some great comments in the chat. So thank you, Lenore, for your comment. And so you wrote that white supremacy believes that others are subhuman to keep power, and the idea about feeling less pain, yet they use beatings and torture to keep them in line. Where are the consciousness of these people? And so, I mean, it's about power, it's about control, and it is about, it's not about conscience. It's about, it's about power and control. And that is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And Helena and David write that who is considered white has changed in the US. Absolutely. Again, a sign that it is a social construct. Who was white in 1800 is not the same as who was white in 1970. And at different times, immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Jews were not considered white. Absolutely. And some groups still hold on to that. Definitely, definitely. And thank you for Lenore for the reference to the bill before the legislature. And so I think it is really important that we actually take the next step and to develop this task force that civil rights groups and various organizations are asking for. And I absolutely support that and think that's really important. Black Lives Matter groups in New Jersey are asking for that support. And I think that's definitely something that needs to happen. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's really critical. So we have plenty of time. This is a great opportunity. If maybe some of the high school students want to ask some questions or make some comments, or if anybody else does, you can click on, if you want to actually speak, there is the reaction button. Just click on raise hand. Or if you would like to put your comment or question into the chat, you can certainly do that as well. So I really invite your thoughts, maybe your connections back to some of the other events that you might have attended that connect to this. Lots of different directions you can go in with comments and questions. Lenore, did you want to chime in there? So you just need to unmute yourself, Lenore.
Yeah, about critical race theory. And when you, yeah, how much that informs your work, and what do you believe is as far as the current push to not to teach it, and sort of not to tell the truth.
Thank you so much. So I have lots of thoughts about critical race theory, and also an entire page on my website with resources. I'm putting that into the chat right now. There are some great videos and articles. So if you're interested in more on that, please take a look at the link in the chat. So interestingly, when I was in graduate school working on my PhD in English, 20 years ago, I focused on critical race theory. And so I found it to be an incredibly valuable method of analysis that came out at that time, really came out of the legal studies field, but focused very much on the notion of racism as systemic. And they would trace through the law the invention of these racial categories and the impact over the years that they've had. And so I found that really valuable and very interesting. And since I was getting a PhD in English and not going to law school, I actually was really interested in connecting that work to contemporary literature, like by Toni Morrison and others. And so, but I've always maintained an interest in critical race theory, and was very surprised when that became a household term and such a hot button issue. And so the anti-critical race theory movement is a well-funded misinformation campaign from the right that is attempting to silence really any types of discussions about the persistence of systemic racism. And so many of the scholars that have been called critical race theorists are actually not critical race theorists, because it is actually a very small group that really has a foundation in the law. But it's a term that's being used to describe almost anybody who's really interested in focusing on racial justice. And so unfortunately, what's been happening over the past year, as you probably know, is that all different kinds of initiatives that really work on addressing racial justice, confronting white supremacy, trying to teach history accurately, like the 1619 Project. I mean, that project is incredibly important. And yet all of this is sort of getting lumped in under the same category of making white people feel bad, especially white children. And so that is the rationale for in states throughout the country, North and South, East and West, for preventing teachers from teaching what they had been teaching, all kinds of books that they had been teaching for years that focus on the civil rights movement or slavery or various aspects of this history. And even if these laws end up getting overturned and deemed unconstitutional, which I think many of them would be, they're still putting a fear in teachers who are already, I mean, we're in a pandemic, for crying out loud. I mean, teachers are already under, a very challenging time. But this is adding to their stress, and, the fear that they are experiencing is just quieting these conversations. And then on top of that, this is also really fueling white parents who don't want to address these issues at all. And that really is, that's another very serious problem. So if white parents are being told that talking about race is racist, which is sort of another message here, that's a real problem, and that's taking us backwards. So I wanted to comment on the question from Marvin and Arlene, and then I see Andy's hand up. So I definitely believe the 1619 Project has historical value. I think the original newspaper set of articles and creative pieces was really important. I recently bought the book that came out that has expanded on that. I haven't finished it. I'm still working my way through it. I think it is incredibly valuable. And what I really appreciate is how interdisciplinary it is. So there are poets writing in, there are historians, there are sociologists, they're all different kinds of people coming from different disciplines. And I think the message that Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of this project, really wanted to focus on is that we need to really think about the way that history is taught. And the history that I was taught was that the founding fathers were heroes, that it was really important that European explorers found this country, and ultimately that the descendants of Europeans civilized it. That's the message I heard growing up. And that's not the truth. That is not just simply not the truth. And I think it's time that we actually learn the truth, teach it. And that to me is the only way to work towards some sort of overall, reconciliation and reparations. And so I definitely think it has value. I recognize that scholars can quibble over the details. That is something scholars do in every single discipline. And so, of course, there are, small disagreements among scholars in every field about, well, what is the best way to talk about racism? What is the best way to do this? But I think certainly most people that care about racial justice will see value in this kind of work. And so, Andy, why don't you go ahead and speak up?
Yeah, let me ask another question. One of the things I don't understand is when states try to things that are uncomfortable, like how we mistreated the African slavery or the Native Americans. I mean, the good thing about teaching that is to show the progress we've made. I know we have ways to go, but it shows the progress we've made. So it's a good thing. What we've done now better, much better, and we're progressing further. So I don't understand why you wouldn't teach that, because then that we've gone, that we've improved things a great deal. And to me, that's a positive, and that just shows that we're progressing and we can progress further. So I don't see why that's not a thing that they'd want to teach. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, I think, Andy, what you just said there doesn't make sense. I mean, I don't think this is a rational approach. I think it is based on irrationality. It's based on fear. And that ultimately, if we really did focus on something rational, then we'd be in a very different place. So yeah, I think that is definitely a problem. I do want to just, there are a couple of great comments in the chat, and then we'll go to Michael. And so there is a comment from Larry about the disproportionate sentencing for drug use. Absolutely, that is an ongoing problem. And at the same time as we're legalizing marijuana, we still have many people in prison for this very drug. And so how on earth do we address this? I mean, this is not just. And we have so many scholars who've talked about this. I mentioned Michelle Alexander. She talks about mass incarceration as the new Jim Crow that really developed in the 1980s and 1990s. So I completely agree that there needs to be radical changes in order to address this. And so, Michael, why don't you go ahead with your comment or question?
Sure. I'm jumping off on what Andy said a little bit. I think there are a lot of folks who are uncomfortable with critical race theory. And basically the argument that I hear is, I'm not a racist, this is, there's absolutely bad things that happened in the past, but that wasn't me. That was people many, many generations ago. And I'm not a racist. And I don't want to make my children feel guilty about something that they didn't participate in, that they didn't do. I don't want to feel bad about this because I'm a good person. And in many ways, what they're saying is largely true, that they're good people, but they don't have that full set of knowledge about what history is. How do you have conversations? I mean, what are your recommendations for having conversations with these people? And I'm talking about coworkers, again, who I feel are good people with a good heart, but they're on the quote unquote other side. But I don't want to disengage from them. I don't want to make them angry. I don't want to make them uncomfortable. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to make any progress until we come to a better shared understanding of what our history was.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I think one of the challenges is that often when people are talking the way that you're just describing, I'm a good person, you know, I didn't do this, that's very much focused on the individual. And so, I mean, what's so ironic is that critical race theorists are not focusing on individual people, they're focusing on larger systems. And so what I would say to people that say, well, I'm not a racist, I'm a good person. And I would say this isn't about you as an individual. And I also, you know, I don't find it helpful to call, I mean, with a few exceptions, maybe, I don't find it helpful to call individual people racist. That is not if you want to engage in a conversation. And so, you know, I think one of the things that is really important is to say, you know, that this is not about you as an individual. This is about understanding our history and the legacy of that history. So our history in the United States very much focused on racism and in genocide and in various types of oppression and injustice. And there are many ways in which the systems we have today continue to perpetuate that, even when individual people aren't necessarily even aware that that's what's happening. And so we'll never be able to address the legacy of what we've inherited if we don't actually look back and understand the history. And so I would really, you know, and I certainly tell other white people, you know, we were not alive during the time of slavery. Our parents were not alive during the time of slavery. And it's not, you know, it's not about that, but we do, I believe, as a white person, I think I have a responsibility to understand what we've inherited. What is the history that occurred in the past, and how is the legacy of that history alive and well today? And what can we do today to work towards justice? And that's something that I would really then, you know, invite various people into to think about. And if we continue to ignore our history, then we're going to continue to not be able to work towards justice. So Bev, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
You know, I don't see how much has really had a major change. I happen to live in Union, and in the 60s, Union, New Jersey was cited with de facto segregation. There was one school that was in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and that was their school, and everybody else went to other schools, and I saw the maps that went right through backyards. So one of my daughters was the first class in what they called Central 6. I made up my mind at that time that that school was going to succeed. And having never been active in a PTA, I became head of the class mothers. And I was that person that had to make the phone calls to the parents to tell them where their children would be picked up on the bus to go to other schools. You know, you cannot imagine some of the comments that I heard. And I didn't want to say anything to insult people, but the temptation was there. But what I don't see, and why I bring this up, I see what's happening now. and there's a sameness. And I find that to be very, very troubling, the sameness. And I want to answer something that Andy said that occurred to me when you have to write what race you are. How about if we all wrote human race?
Thank you, Bev. So I just want to point out and echo your comment about the racial segregation patterns that existed in the past in New Jersey are very much alive and well today. So today, New Jersey is one of the most racially segregated states in the entire country, with one of the most racially segregated school systems in the entire country. A couple of years back, Rutgers University and some other academic organizations did a study, and they called the type of segregation in New Jersey public schools, K to 12, to be apartheid level segregation.
Right.
And so you may or may not be aware that right now there is a lawsuit that is pending, and we might hear something soon about that. That is, many groups came together in New Jersey to sue the state about the fact that our state constitution prohibits the kind of racial segregation that we currently have. And so that is a huge, huge issue. I also just want to acknowledge Lenore's comment in the chat about anti-Semitic comments and the perpetuation of false Jewish myths. So thank you, Lenore, for that. Absolutely. I'm not sure if if there's a lot that I can say about that. I definitely agree that anti-Semitism is on the rise and is another part of the vicious cycle of the persistence of systemic racism. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's part of the work that we need to address. And so I just want to, again, I see some comments in the chat. And so Ruth is asking, have the white parents ever considered the hurt feelings of Black children? Thank you so much for asking that. That is a great question. That is a great question. You might be aware that I believe it was in Tennessee, the school had been reading a book, a children's book by Ruby Bridges about her experience dealing with racism and racial segregation. And white parents insisted that book no longer be read in the school because it upset white children. But of course, again, the question here that Ruth is asking, well, what about the feelings of Black children and the ongoing racism that Black children are experiencing? And Larry mentions about the New York City school system is still highly segregated. Absolutely. And yes, Michael, thank you for that. I was just going to say that this really fascinating podcast called Nice White Parents, which focuses on racial school segregation in New York City. Really a very, very powerful podcast series. I definitely recommend that as well. So we still have a little bit more time. I would again welcome additional questions, additional comments. There's obviously a lot to think about here. I see some more in the chat here, so that's great. So how many people, Helena and David are asking how many people in this group have close friends and relatives that are people of color. Until you know people like that, you don't really have a grasp on a personal level what they experience. Thank you for that. Again, I'll just go back to the issue of segregation. If we live in segregated communities, our chances of interracial friendships is much lower. White people especially are much more likely today to have few or no friends of color. The documentary 13th, an excellent recommendation that came out a while back on Netflix, So thank you, Lenore, for that recommendation. That is a really powerful way to understand the history and the impact of the 13th Amendment, that we think of the 13th Amendment as abolishing slavery, but yet it has this little, just essentially this loophole in there that is like, well, except for people that are identified as having committed a crime or being called a criminal. And so not surprisingly, after the 13th Amendment was passed, and then the 14th and 15th, the definition of crime changed. And so it then became a crime to like loiter, or to essentially just be, walking around. And so there were so many Black people that were picked up for that and then forced into prison labor camps after the Civil War was over. So yeah, thank you for highlighting. And then that history again goes all the way to the present. Yes, Me and White Supremacy. That's another excellent book that has some, I think there are a couple of different versions of the book. I think there's some with like questions and reflections in it, which can be really helpful for like as a workbook. That's great. Yeah, Lenore.
Yeah, okay. I just want to say this really quickly to Bev's point about that there's a sameness, and what can we do and how troubling it is. And I think I just want to make a plug for the Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Committee, because we know that and we're trying to do that. Just, like put one foot in front of the other and just try to do it. So if anybody's interested, please contact me. Okay.
Thank you, Lenore.
Commercial over.
And to Jeffrey's question, so I am certainly not remotely an expert on epigenetics, but I will just make a brief comment about that. So there's plenty of evidence that racism is bad for people's health, and that experiencing racism and the stress of that is very much a cause of all kinds of health problems. But then when we think about epigenetics and what happens in utero, that is another manifestation of the trauma of racism and the impact on at the fetal level and the future, future generations. And so that's absolutely another something else that's really important to keep in mind. Yet another reason to end the cycle of racism and white supremacy.
I raised that because recently there was a meeting in Washington where it was brought up, if you're going to have reparations, you need to show some nexus. If you can show that the generations of Blacks in America have, epigenetic changes, which are causing them to get sicker or to have all these other issues, you can show that connection. And then here's just a plug. One of the main researchers in this field is my little sister, Dr. Joan Kaufman. So when I heard about it, I read her article, which is what the Democratic Congress people were supporting and using for their argument. So I just thought it's another piece of the puzzle we should all be aware of.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Absolutely, that work is really important. Thank you. And then Larry is asking, do you believe the newer generations are doing better on decreasing racism? Sometimes, sometimes not. I certainly think there are ways in which younger people are more open to conversations, but yet, just like everybody else who have grown up in the United States, they've absorbed the false racial myths that I've been talking about. And I certainly hear some people my age or older think, oh, everything will be fine in a few generations because this will just sort of fizzle out. And that I do not remotely believe at all. I think that, we are continuing to perpetuate these false racial myths, and young people are continuing to absorb them. And it is only when we take, we take action actively to address these myths, debunk them, and to work on repairing the harm caused, that we can actually make change. So there might be, some ways in which younger people are focused more on justice, but not in the way that means that we can just sit back. So Peter, go ahead.
One of the things in the 70s, I worked for an organization that was trying to register young voters because we thought, oh, they'll be more liberal. We thought that will turn the country around. And we did a statistical survey. Well, I don't know if the statistics were really good, but we did a slight survey that showed that the young people were voting the same as their parents. It was disappointing. And so I think that points to the conclusion that change doesn't happen automatically. If you want to change, you have to work hard on the change, and it's very difficult. And you have to be committed to trying to change, or you'll be the same as you started out.
Absolutely, Peter. I know that some say that the arc of the universe bends towards justice, but it doesn't do that if people aren't pushing it in that direction. I think we have just a couple of minutes, so I just want to make sure that anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question or make a comment has an opportunity to do so in the chat, or to raise their hand and to speak up. So I'm just going to take a moment again to give you a few resources in the chat. So I just want to remind you again about if you are interested in looking at additional articles and other kinds of resources like videos about anything that I talked about today, the link that I just put into the chat covers a lot of that. And if you are especially, interested in digging into some of the things that I talked about today even further, I'm putting into the chat a link to my book for sale at Rutledge. And then please make sure that you're using the promo code, the coupon code for 30% off that is in the chat there as well. If it's convenient, I would love for you to ask your local library to get the book if they don't have it already. That is certainly a good way to make sure that it's available. So Lenore, maybe I'll turn things back to you.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Gaffney, for an enlightening, wonderful, provocative presentation, and it was everything we hoped for. And I want to say again, as Peter just said, and several others, that yes, there's work to be done. And it may seem daunting. It seems daunting to me many times, many days, but it's one step in front of the other. So we do have a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee here at Temple Sinai. And this is what we do. Please let me know, if you're interested. We have requested the book, Dr. Gaffney's book, for the Temple Library, so it will be there. And it's good. So if anybody wants to read it, and again, thank you all for coming. It was a wonderful morning. I'm happy to see everybody, and thank you again, Dr. Gaffney. Larry and I heard Dr. Gaffney a number of years ago at in Basking Ridge, and then we heard her again at the consultation on conscience down in South Jersey with Eric Ward, and somebody else, I can't remember his name, but it was wonderful. So thanks again for everybody, and thank you for coming.
Thank you again, everyone.
Okay.
And feel free to email me. I put my email address in the chat if you want to follow up with anything.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful morning.
Thank you very much.
Enlightening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right, I'm gonna end things here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michal.
Of course.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.